thank everyone for coming tonight. I'd like to recognize a few people who are here today. I'd like to recognize Rabbi Wine. Thank you so much for coming. Rabbi Fromowitz, I saw you somewhere. Thank you so much for joining us. And we'd also like to recognize at this time Mr. Paul Schiffman, who is here somewhere. Thank you so much for being here. So much of what we're doing tonight is because of your guidance and your efforts. We come together tonight to be inspired, to grow from the life of a dear friend of ours, Rabbi Yosef Kalter. Rabbi Kalter's life was defined by many things, but perhaps one of the most recognizable features of how Rabbi Yosef Kalter lived his life was with his faith, with his bitachon. He believed in God. And the great Musar teachers tell us that the true mark of a Baal Bitachon, of a person who has faith and relies on God, can be recognized by the fact that a person who really believes in God and really has faith and understands that everything comes from God, you have a certain equanimity to how you live your life. A certain calmness. Nothing phases you. You're never afraid, because after all, God's in control. Rabbi Yossi lived his life that way, and he taught us through his life. He inspired us. But he also inspired us on how he returned his soul to his Creator. One point when Yossi was turned a real turn for the worse, he was in the hospital, and I'll never forget. Naturally, it was a very chaotic moment, and one of the nurses walked in, was explaining to him, the gravity of the scenario, and I'll never forget. He looked her straight in the eye, and he said, "I want you to know, I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid of what's before me." He taught us how to live. He also taught us how to die. Rabbi Kalter was here for way too short. And nonetheless, Las Vegas to Rabbi Yossi, Las Vegas was home. He came here to inspire. He came here to teach. He came here to make a difference to our community. And I'll never forget the last conversation I had with Rabbi Yossi just a few days before his passing. And he told me, I could tell, it bothered him so much. He said, I have so much unfinished business. I came to Las Vegas to make a difference, to inspire, to teach. And I got to get back there. And I remember thinking that it's so hard. He came here, he was here for so short. He was taken way too soon. And then, as we heard the news of his passing and boarded a plane to say goodbye, to go to his funeral, never forget, on the plane, sitting next to Rabbi Davidowitz, and we get a text message. The Silver family would like to dedicate the new Kollel Beis Medrash in his memory. And it was a moving moment. Heart skipped a beat. And at that moment I realized, although he was here for way too short, he was able to inspire. And his legacy and his memory made a difference and will live on to inspire our community, to grow together, to become shleimim, to become complete and have that bitachon, that faithfulness that he had in his Creator. I'd like to call on Rabbi David Katenik to say a few words at this time.
Thank you, Rabbi Meth. The Rosh Hashanah davening, it says, "Ato zocher masei olam upoked kol yitzirei kedem." You remember all the events and all the creations from the beginning of time. So we know Rosh Hashanah is a day of remembrance, a day of judgment, and a day that all living beings are judged. Why would it be a day of remembrance and a day of judgment for people that have lived all the way since the beginning of time? What's it relevant to them? And the answer, a very beautiful answer, is that what a person accomplishes in their lifetime does not simply last for their lifetime. What the person accomplishes goes on and on. So what a person does in this world, whether it's good, whether it's bad, will continue. And every Rosh Hashanah, Hashem takes that into account in the judgment of those who are living and those who have already passed from this world. Hashem takes that into account and looks at that and says, what has this person's deeds done in his lifetime, 100 years ago, 200 years, 1,000 years ago, that's affecting the world now? Why are people doing good because of that person, or are people doing bad because of that person? Has the person inspired others? Has the person detracted from others? Rabbi Kalter had that effect on people in Las Vegas. In a short time here, when he was well, he inspired people with his sincerity, his good midos, his fine character traits, his desire, his yearning to bring them closer to Torah. When he was sick, as Rabbi Meth mentioned, inspired others as well. So one of my congregants actually informed me before Rabbi Kalter's last Yom Kippur, and we know how sick he was. He was talking to him about how hard he was going to try to fast that Yom Kippur in his state. This congregant, sure enough, that Yom Kippur got very, very ill, violently ill, nauseous and really bad. And then he could not imagine how was he going to make it through this Yom Kippur. And then he had the image in his mind of Rabbi Kalter pushing himself in his state, and he says, I'm going to do it as well. There are two types of a memorial. There is a memorial where you build a building. You have a building, has a sign, a bridge, a monument, whatever it may be. And then there's nothing really that comes from it. It's just an edifice. It's just there. And then you have memorials where the person's deeds live on, as Rabbi Kalter. The deeds live on. What he has done, what he's accomplished, how he's inspired others, will year after year build on itself exponentially as more people are affected by what he did and they pass it on to others, to their friends, to their colleagues, to their children. This building, this Beis Medrash, which is named after Rabbi Kalter, is an edifice, has a sign outside. And it was built with the deeds that Yossi committed in his lifetime and how he influenced others. But it has a very unique quality as well. A quality that it's not just simply his deeds that he did. It's not the fact that it's a building with a sign. But it's a building where people will come in and be inspired by that which inspired Rabbi Kalter. It will be an instigator for more Torah and more mitzvos and more ma'asim tovim, and people coming closer to what Rabbi Kalter wanted to accomplish in Las Vegas, his dream. It's not just a remembering of the past. It's not just a physical structure. It'll be an instigator and an inspiration to move everyone forward, to bring everyone closer to Torah, and
hopefully to answer the rest. The Tanchuma, the Medrash Tanchuma explains, what did the Jews, when they said Na'aseh v'nishma, when they said we'll do whatever you say, what then did they have to be forced about with the mountain? They had to be forced to accept the oral Torah. They said to God, write it down, whatever's in the book we'll take. We're not prepared to accept the oral Torah. This, by the way, was the movement of the Sadducees and the Karaites and certain movements throughout Jewish history who said we will not accept the Torah, the oral explanation, only the written one. Now, there's a lot of problems with that approach. That's a discussion in and of itself, really. But you understand that it's kind of hard. It says on, Sukkot, you will take the fruit of a goodly tree. Right? And you never found anybody using anything but an esrog. Right? That's the fruit of a goodly tree. Give me an apple. Give me a pear. Give me a peach. the only thing you could come up with was a lemon on steroids. You know what I mean? This bumpy, thing like this. That's the fruit of a goodly tree. Yet everyone seemed to know that's what it meant. How did they know? When Moshe comes down with the book and it says the fruit of a goodly tree, he says, what does this mean? Whatever you think. What do you mean, whatever I think? We're going to have a fruit salad? Everybody's going to walk in here with a different piece of fruit? Somehow they knew that's what it meant. I think the most dramatic example is when the pasuk says, and God said to Moses, you will slaughter the animals the way I showed you on the mountain. Well, obviously that meant that there was an oral tradition that Moshe had already when he came at Mount Sinai that God wanted him to keep. But I'm not even getting into that for now. It's a discussion itself. But they said we'll accept the oral Torah and not the written Torah, and that's what they had to be coerced to accept. So what was the purpose of this coercion? What were they trying to do? Often the way that we answer questions is by asking another question, right? Somebody asked this once to a rabbi, why do you Jews answer every question with a question? And he said, why not? But anyway, but what we do sometimes, and this is one of the things they teach us in Rabbi school, is that if you ask like a really good question and then you ask 4 or 5 more questions and you answer those, nobody remembers the original question. It doesn't really matter anymore. So, it's like one of the things they teach you is if you don't know the answer to the question, tell an interesting story. But anyway, that reminds me. There's a Gemara in Becharos, a very strange Gemara in Becharos, which tells the following story. The king forced Rabbi Yeshua to debate the wise men of Athens. And the wise men of Athens obviously represented the best that Greek civilization had to offer. And Rabbi Yeshua was of the Talmudic school of study. Now, these two schools are completely different. If you've ever studied Greek philosophy, you've heard the expression a Socratic dialogue. A Socratic dialogue is basically Socrates talking, and he creates a straw man to present the arguments, and that guy is left to just saying at the end, oh yes, O Socrates, how wise, O Socrates, indeed, O Socrates, right? And that's how it goes. They're just there to present an argument. You can find this even in Jewish works. The Ramchal in Das Tfunos has what's called a Socratic argument, where one side is merely there to be a Greek chorus for the main point that he's trying to make, If you've ever studied Talmud, it's not like that at all. You fight to the death. You take no prisoners. Rabbi Yochanan, who was the person the greatest moving force between the Jerusalem Talmud, you'll find sometimes the Gemara will say, Tiyufta de Rabbi Yochanan Tiyufta. Tiyufta is like a total disproof. And we don't want to say it once, we say it twice to make sure. Tiyufta de Rabbi Yochanan Tiyufta. Blow him out of the water. Wrong. Say it again. Wrong. I didn't hear you. Wrong! It's like fight to the death. It's always so much fun if you walk into a Beis Medrash and you see 2 people screaming at each other. You're sure these people must hate each other's guts. What are you talking about? You don't know how to learn. You don't know anything. And then they're like, want to go for a coffee? Yeah, okay, And go back to the Beis Medrash and start screaming at each other again, It's a beautiful experience. But anyway, so someone said to me once, why do Jewish men learn Gemara? I said, because otherwise we'd be holding up liquor stores, You have all this hostility, you get it out in the Beis Medrash instead of going home and hitting your family. Anyway, so it's like this, it's like, could you speak to your son? He's out of control. What do you mean? I don't understand. Explain out of control. I don't understand the terminology. So, okay. Anyway, the Gemara in Becharos describes this debate. Now it's going to be the final conflict, the Talmudic study against the Greek philosophy. Yeah. So the Greeks set up a condition, as the nations of the world often have when we've tried to have debates. They set up conditions, right? The exception was the famous vikuach between the Ramban and Pablo Cristiani in Spain, where they actually made a movie about it called The Disputation, and there was an honest give and take, but usually they set up ground rules that becomes impossible. So the wise men of Athens say, okay, we'll have a debate with you, but only in riddles. We're going to have a debate of riddles. Yeah, it's like Bilbo and Golem, Lahavdil, right? Only a debate and riddles. I'm a fountain of worthless information. Anyway, I once had a Rebbe who said to me, if only you could learn to use your mind for good instead of evil, imagine what you could have accomplished. But anyway, so it's going to be riddles. Now this is very hard. This is what they do throughout history, when we've been forced to have a debate. It was a story in one town where the priest managed to get the king all upset, as they do, and forced the Jews to come to a debate between him and the rabbi. And if the priest wins, then all the Jews will either be baptized or be forced to leave. And if the Jews win, then we'll release them from the special Jewish taxes that have been subjected to. This kind of thing happened throughout history. This one town, they show up. The rabbi gets up at the podium and the priest gets up and the whole town is gathered there. And the priest says, wait, there'll be a condition. This will not be a debate with words. It will be in pantomime. No words will be spoken. It's okay. The rabbi's not given a choice. That's what it's going to be, right? So the priest gets up and he goes first and he goes. And the rabbi goes. The priest is surprised that the rabbi was able to respond so quickly. And he thinks and he goes. And the rabbi goes. He starts to sweat, the priest. He starts to pace up and down. He's thinking. Suddenly he thinks. He reaches down and picks up a bottle of wine and a loaf of bread. And the rabbi nods knowingly and reaches into his pocket and pulls out an apple. And the priest says, I give up. He's too smart. He counters everything. I come up with it quickly. He wins. And the king's like, okay. And he signs the declaration and everybody goes home until just the priest and the priest and the king are left. And the king says, listen, I may not be the brightest penny in the pile, but I didn't follow that at all. He says, you didn't follow what happened? He goes, no, I said, you Jews think you're the chosen people, but God is up in heaven and he's abandoned you. And the rabbi said, no, God is right here with us. So then I said to him, God is three, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. And he said, hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. And then I took out the bread and the wine, signifying that only by communion of the Savior can you be freed from sin. And he pulled out an apple and said, that's because you believe in original sin. But we Jews believe that anyone can get close to God. He says, I had no idea we had such a scholar amongst us, because I've never met a man like him in my life. So they get back to the shul for mincha. And everyone says, so Rabbi, what was that about? He says, I'll tell you the truth, I have no idea. He says, but what were you answering? He goes, I don't know. He said, you Jews get out of here. I said, we're going to stay right here. And he says, I'll slap you in the face. I said, you do it, I'll poke you in the eye. And then he took out his lunch and I took out my lunch and it was over. So it's always hard when they set conditions, you understand, to be able to do it well, So it's going to be just a debate and riddles. So there's a whole bunch of different riddles, but here's one of the riddles. The wise men of Athens say to Rabbi Yeshua, how do you preserve salt? Okay, it's a tough one. Salt's a preservative. It doesn't spoil. How do you preserve salt? So Rabbi Yeshua thinks and he says, with the placenta of a mule. When you take a horse and a donkey and you cross them, you get a mule. It's a good question, by the way. No one else knows either, but at least you asked it. You're still at an age where you feel like it's okay to ask questions. Everybody else just goes, yeah, okay. I'm like, with the placenta of a mule, to which the wise men of Athens responds, a mule doesn't have a placenta. Huh? And Yeshua says, and salt doesn't spoil. Well, that answers all of our questions. Thank you very much. What? Or I get to teach in girls' seminaries, as one of them said so well, that's so random. I have 8 daughters of my own, so it's one of the reasons I travel. Anyway, it's the only chance I get to the bathroom to myself, but I was going to open my own seminary. I was going to call it Orlofsky. Anyway, but So I'm bilingual. I speak girl. Anyway, not a lot of guys do. It's a mystery. But that's like so random. What does this mean? Yeah. So I saw a beautiful explanation of this once, and it goes like this. Yeah. The wise men of Athens say to Rabbi Yeshua, "What is the salt that's preserved you people?" Now, you Jews already at this point, you guys have been around for 1,500 years. That's very impressive. You guys have had a real long run. But hey, you're starting to lose it. People are leaving you. Hellenism, it's the wave of the future. It's already 200 CE. Modern times, get with it. Put on a toga, throw a discus, watch a tragedy. You know what I mean? You got to get with it. You guys are still doing the same old thing. Your salt is starting to spoil. Whatever it is that has preserved you, your Torah for thousands of years, it's total spoil. You got to take from our society and include it. He says, "Oh, I could do that. You know what? I'll add the placenta of a mule." Why? How do you make a mule?
You take a donkey and horse.
Thank you. But someone was paying attention. Anyway, you say Mr. Horse marries Mrs. Donkey, and you have a mule. Now, a mule has certain advantages over either a horse or a donkey. It has more stamina, it's stronger, it can go longer. It has one serious drawback. It's sterile. It cannot reproduce. He says, "You want me to add something to it? I'll add something to it." The placenta of a mule. So he said, "Wait a second, but a mule doesn't have a placenta." He says, "I know, and salt doesn't spoil." Which means, you want me to take the salt. You want me to take the Torah. You want to take me Judaism that has kept the Jews alive for so long and mix in something else. Create something new, some kind of a hybrid to make a mule. I can make a mule. And it'll be very effective for one generation. And then it will die out. Because salt doesn't really spoil. Yeah, there'll be times when other things might be more popular. Other things come along. But once you water it down, once you make a mule out of it, there's no hope. The Jews said, "We will accept the Torah, but we don't want an interpretation or interpretive rights to be given to a group of rabbis. We'll decide what it means. We'll make it relevant for us." So God held the mountain over their head like a barrel. Not like a rock, not like a mountain, like a barrel. What do you use a barrel for in the old days? Preservative. You kept fish, you kept wine, you kept whatever you were going to preserve, you put it into a barrel. I'll give it a more modern example, a glass jar. He held the mountain over their head like a glass jar and says, "Okay, don't accept the oral interpretation, but I've got this glass jar waiting for you. I'm not going to kill you. But when you die out, and trust me, you will, I'm going to put this little glass cage over you, this little glass jar, and you'll go into a museum and say, there used to be these weird people who lived and followed this religion, but they're gone. Because you'll never survive." Why? Because you'll always interpret the Torah in a way that makes sense to you. But it's not going to make sense to the next generation. So you're out in the desert. You're miraculously eating mun and drinking from this well that rolls along with you. And now you're going to go into Israel and you're going to be farmers and craftsmen. And your children are going to say, "Come on, Dad, we got to go and plow." Goes, "Oh, plow." When I was in the desert, the manna fell from the sky. It goes, "Right there, but we're not in the desert anymore. Let's go. Got to dig a well." We had this well that rolled along with us. We didn't got right there, but this is it. That's over. You're from the old country. You're telling me over stuff that has no relevance to my life. It's a new world. What made sense to you doesn't make sense to me. And we lived in our land for 850 years, and then we go into exile. And the people who remembered the land of Israel and what it was like to be independent and to be agriculturalists, now we're in Babylonia. And now we have to live in exile under foreign governments. We have to live under different situations. And those people who are trying to remember what it was like when we were an independent nation, they don't get it. There's a new reality here. And that's where the Purim story takes place. What happened in the Purim story? Mordechai tells them, Don't go to the king's banquet. It's a trick. He wants you to eat non-kosher. He wants you to have assimilation so that God's protection will not be on you anymore, so he can destroy you. And they said to him, Mordechai, Reb Mordechai, Ha-Yehudi, Reb Yid, yeah, fine, nice guy, but you're from the old country. Sit in the Beis Medrash, we'll bring you a chicken and you'll tell us if it's kosher, but stay out of real life because you don't understand. We have to go to the party, we have to work with the government, you don't know, old man, go off to the side. When Haman came out, he was bedecked with idols, and everybody had to bow down to him, so that they were in the process bowing down to idols. And Mordechai says, you don't bow down to idols. And they're like, Mordechai, listen, you got to do something over here because we're going to get into trouble. He says, no, you don't bow down to idols. Okay, you and your crazy chumras, you're going to get into trouble. You gotta, make concessions, kind of say, yeah. And the whole time, everyone was saying, Mordechai doesn't get it. He doesn't understand. At the end, when they expected to see Mordechai hanging on the gallows, and instead they saw Haman, and they see Mordechai come out in the royal robes with the king's ring, they said, you know something? Those old rabbis might know something anyway. Maybe there's something that we didn't understand. And then, Kimu v'kiblu, they accepted upon themselves the oral Torah that they hadn't accepted at Mount Sinai, because they saw firsthand that, there's a wisdom in the old tradition, in the old-time religion. Last week was my father's yortzeit. He passed away about 19 years ago. And it's an interesting thing. Yaakov Kamenetsky was on a plane with a professor from Hebrew University. And Rabbi Yaakov's grandson kept coming over to him and saying, does Zaidi want this? Does Zaidi want that? Can I get you this? Can I get you that? And he was just, being very, attentive. And the professor said, if my grandson was here, he would hide in the back and pretend he doesn't know me. I'm really surprised that your grandson does this. And Rabbi Yaakov says, you understand why? Because all you have as a basis for your past is evolution. So you came from a monkey. So as far as your grandson's concerned, you're a bigger monkey than he is. You're 2 generations closer to being a monkey. He says, we believe that God revealed himself on Mount Sinai. I'm 2 generations closer to Mount Sinai. When Shneur Cutler, who was the Rosh Yeshiva of Lakewood, his son died in a car crash. So a number of great sages came to pay a shiva call, and they asked the question, why is it that you mourn a year for a parent and only a month for a child? So Soloveitchik was there, and he said, because of the parent starts to get old, and after they pass away, you feel like, listen, maybe it was time already. You need a whole year to remember it. He says, but by a child, you don't think you can ever get up again. So you have to get up, and you have to go back and face life. That's what he said. Rav Ruderman gave a different answer, the Rosh Yeshiva of Ner Yisrael. He said, it's because when you mourn for anyone, it's 30 days. A brother, a spouse, a child, it's always 30 days. The exception is a parent. Because by a parent, you're not just mourning for your tragedy, you're mourning that you lost a link to the earlier generations. That's what Rav Ruderman said. It was interesting. I heard Rabbi Frand, who's one of his students, he said about Rabbi Ruderman, he said, when you shook his hand, you shook the hand that shook the hand of the Alta of Slobodka. He took you back to Europe, to a different generation. As long as he was alive, he took you back. Interestingly enough, when Moshe Chait passed away, Rosh Yeshiva Chavetz Chaim in Israel, Rabbi Orlofsky said the same thing. He says, we're not mourning Rabbi Chait, we're mourning Rabbi David Leibowitz, because as long as Rabbi Chait was alive, Rabbi David was alive. You could see him in him. So when a parent passes away, they take you back to a time that we can only read about in history books. So I'll take a minute, if I can, to speak about my father. My father, his parents, my grandfather came from Vengrov, Poland. I'm sure most of you have vacationed there. And Came to Brooklyn, went into the Brownsville section of Brooklyn, which is just about as good as Vengrove as far as I'm concerned, you know. And my father grew up, his father never learned how to speak English, you know. He grew up in a house that was nominally Orthodox, but he had no Jewish education. He didn't know anything. My father used to describe it as, you know, he used to go to the old men in the synagogue and ask why. And they said, because. My father said, that's not good enough. He was right, but that's all you got back then, you know. So my father grew up in the Depression. He had to, you know, pull himself up. He started a flower shop. He got himself going. Married a nice Jewish girl. I don't know if anyone's from the New York area, but in Queens, there's something called the Green Line Bus Company. My grandfather started that with one bus. Built it into a whole bus company, and then when he died, his brothers, who he brought across from Europe and put into the business, squeezed my grandmother out. So I lost my bus company. Instead of a rabbi, I could have been a balabas. Anyway, it's a true story. I can't help it if it happens to be a great line, but it's true. I go through Queens, I go, that's my bus. That's my bus. Anyway, so he married a nice Jewish girl. They moved out to the suburbs. They had 6 boys, of whom I'm the quietest. And people who know my brothers are like, it's true, you know what I mean? And that's it. And they started a synagogue. You know, we moved out to Long Island, moved out to the suburbs. There was, you know, nobody in Las Vegas can really appreciate this, but sometimes when you move to a new community, there's not always, you know, any facilities. You have to build from scratch. You know what I mean? Like, here, you're lucky that you're in an old, established community. Shul's going back hundreds of years, but you know, but moved out to the suburbs, everything was just brand new. You know, so you had to start from scratch. My father was one of the founding members of a conservative synagogue called the East Meadow Jewish Center. I spoke to one of the other founders. He said we were starting out, it was in the 1950s, and we invited down representatives from the 3 movements. Now, most of us came from Orthodox homes. Reform, it wasn't for us. It was too different than what we were used to. He says, the Orthodox, they had nothing to offer us. They weren't established enough. The conservative movement came out and they said, we will give you a rabbi, we'll pay you salary for the first 2 years, we'll give you seed money, we'll give you a constitution, you'll become part of the United Synagogue, you'll have U.S. wife for your kids, we'll give you all of the services. And we said that was great. And what was better, he said, was that it still had the flavor of an Orthodox synagogue, although we were free to do whatever we wanted, you know? My father used to tell me, you know, in his own words, he said, you know, because he went to the local Reform synagogue, they would not give you an aliyah if you were wearing a yarmulke. So I don't know how it works everywhere, but they wouldn't give you an aliyah if you were wearing a yarmulke. You know, so he says an Orthodox guy always wears his yarmulke. A Reform guy never does. A conservative guy carries it in his pocket. So he needs it, he puts it on. You know, that's the way my father used to describe it. So we went to synagogue on the high holidays. We all had bar mitzvahs. My brothers all went. They found that of 100 kids, 3 will become Orthodox, 17 will become Reform, 30 will remain conservative, and 50 will disaffiliate. That was my generation. The majority of the people that I knew dropped out. That was a reality. In the 80s, they did a study and they found that the average age of a conservative Jew was in the 50s. The average age of an Orthodox Jew was in the teens. That means that something was going on here, something very strange. By the end of the 1980s, they started talking about the problem of Orthodox triumphalism. What does that mean? That means that the New York Federation released a study that was very criticized because people didn't like the conclusion, not because the study was inaccurate, is that we should start funneling more, you know, money to traditional organizations, you know, in Orthodox places, because they're the only ones that are going to be around in 30 years. And today, when you see, you know, when you read what's going on in the conservative movement and the struggle for relevance and existence, you know, well, how could this be? They were it. They were unbelievable. They were the best. They were, but they made a mule. They made something that was perfect for people like my parents who had grown up Orthodox and now were dropping down. And it was perfect. It had the same tunes, it had the same this. They reminded them of the old country. But to us, it had no meaning to us. We didn't remember what a Shabbos was. We never remembered from Brownsville and the Lower East Side. You know? A guy from London told me that Penny Park Lane, I think it's called, is where the old Jewish community was. He says, we didn't keep Shabbos, we didn't keep Pesach, we didn't keep Yom Kippur. What did we keep? Every Sunday morning, my father would put us in the car, drive us to Penny Park Lane. We'd buy whitefish and lox and herring and bagels and pickles, and he'd say, take a deep whiff, kids. This is Judaism. And that was it. That was all there was. But if you don't have anything to back it up, if you don't have anything to remember that you're remembering, and it went from being the future to becoming nothing. How did that happen? So, those old rabbis from Europe who had survived the war came across to America. And they saw that it was a place where Torah had never taken off. It didn't exist. And they said they looked around and they saw all kinds of problems in the community with Shabbos observance and with kosher observance and with all kinds of different areas. And they said there's only one thing to focus on, and that is the study of Torah. Because salt doesn't spoil. Give the old time Torah, nothing fancy, and you'll see that it'll make a change. And they put their efforts into building day schools and to making Jewish schools. That was where they put their emphasis into Torah Masorah and building Jewish education. My brother, I have 5 brothers. One of my brothers is a genius. And every Jewish kid is a genius, you know. And when I say he's a genius, I mean he went to Brandeis on a full scholarship, graduated first in his class. He went to Duke Law School, graduated first in his class. They give out 7 special awards. He won 5 of them. He was offered a clerkship at the Supreme Court. He had a fellowship in Yale. He was a bright boy. So he was in public school, and in 6th grade, he got into a fight with the teacher about Constantine. I know that's an emotional issue for most 6th graders. And he challenged her to a debate, and like an idiot, she accepted. And my brother wiped the floor with her, so the principal called in my father and said, listen, you got to send him to a private school. Now, my father knew from a private school. He grew up in Brownsville, you know what I mean? So that meant the yeshiva. So Rabbi Findel had started the Hebrew Academy in Nassau County, and he took my brother, who was going into 7th grade, and he convinced him to send the 3 younger boys. And the 3 younger boys, one by one, it took us a while, but one by one we all returned to Torah observant lifestyles, and eventually my father did too. And you know, when he passes away, he leaves behind 37 grandchildren, all of whom are being brought up in Torah tradition. He just would have had his 40th great-grandchild, all of whom are being brought up in Torah tradition. And if I look at my father and my mother's family tree, there are lines where there's nobody even Jewish anymore, either through intermarriage or they just decided not to get married or they decided not to have kids. And my father is looking at 37 grandchildren and so far 40 great-grandchildren, and most of the grandchildren haven't even hit their stride yet, you know. And, you know, who knows what's going to be left behind. It's frightening to think of it, you know. At one point, the joke will actually be true, you know, because people come to me and go, Orlofsky, are you related to the famous Rabbi Orlofsky? And I said, no, Orlofsky is a very common name. And they're like, oh, because I thought, nope. Anyway, so one day that might be true at the rate we're going. But, you know, I look at what my father leaves behind, and there's only for one reason. Because he decided that salt doesn't spoil. When everybody else made a mule, and that mule couldn't reproduce, my father sacrificed to get us a Jewish education. My mother told me years later that, you know, my father went bankrupt at one point. I said, when was that? He says, just about when you were born. She says, every child brings their own luck, she said to me. You know? And he was slowly recovering, and now to send 4 kids to yeshiva and pay 4 yeshiva tuitions, it was very difficult, even with whatever scholarship they owed him, you know. My father told me the story, and I also heard it from the principal with pride, that he comes in, you know, years later, some years later, with the scholarship committee, and they offer him whatever scholarship it was, and he says, I refuse to pay a penny more than full. And they said, I'm sorry, sir, then you're going to have to take your children out of the school, and I'm not going to do this, because I'm sorry, that's all you're getting out of me is full tuition. Because no, I'm sorry, sir, this is all we're going to give you. And the other guy says, Bob, he's offering you more. No, I'm sorry, Mr. Orlofsky, what did you say? Nothing more than full tuition. He says, you're turning down the scholarship? He says, yeah. He Says, you're the first parent in the history of the school to turn down a scholarship. He says, thank God I don't need it. And the principal told me, I didn't hear this from my father, that he paid back all the scholarship money he had gotten over all the years once he was in a position to do it. You know? And because he made that sacrifice to be able to get his family a Jewish education. My friends, I was invited to come and speak in Minneapolis. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of the Gurmazians. They might ring a bell. Anyway, they have built the two largest malls in the world. One of them in Edmonton, Canada, and one in Minneapolis. What do the two cities have in common? They're both miserably cold. Like, it's not unusual to have 40 below zero temperatures, you know? It's miserable. So you want to live inside a mall, obviously, you know? So, that's what they... So, I went to speak in Minneapolis, and it was in May. And the weather was in the 80s, it was sunny, you know, and I said, wow, it's beautiful here. He says, oh yeah, you should move out here. It's like this all the time. So that's one of the nice things about coming out to Vegas in February, is it's beautiful. The problem is I was here in 1968 with my family in July, and I almost died when I walked outside of the hotel, you know what I mean? You know, it's like I was down in Phoenix, which also gets nice and hot, you know. And they said, yeah, but it's a dry heat. I said, oh, good, I don't mind going to hell as long as there's no humidity, you know what I mean? It's a dry heat, that's fine, you know. You know, gosh, I remember when I was here, you know, I walked outside, I couldn't breathe, the air was so hot, it went in my lungs, you know what I mean? So, you know, so we grow up, and every place has its own interesting things. I was speaking in Miami, actually in Boca, in between Hurricane Ivan and Hurricane Janine. And like there was no electricity, you know, they just got back on the electricity, everything was flooded, trees are down everywhere, you know, it was like hurricane after hurricane. I said to people, why do you live here? They said, what do you mean, the weather? So okay, everybody sees the good in where they live, you know, except for New Yorkers. We have nothing good to say about that place. Nothing. That's what makes us New Yorkers, you know. You know, we hate our own city, and so does everybody else, which is what's nice, you know. You know, the reason we love the Yankees is because everybody else hates them. You know what I mean? And that's enough for us. That's all we need, you know. So, you know, so you know, you take a look and. A group of very, very dedicated people came out to Las Vegas with one purpose in mind, to bring Torah, to bring the salt, to be able to give that preservative that has kept the Jews around for almost 3,500 years. Yeah, Noach Weinberg from Eshet Torah used to say, we Jews have been accused of everything. You know, ritual slaughter of children for their blood, you know, host desecration, you know, everything they could think of they said about us. The one thing they never said is that we're stupid. And if we've been around for all this time, it's because we found out something that Rabbi Yeshua told the Greeks. Salt doesn't spoil. Real Torah doesn't spoil. You know, there are people who try to come with all kinds of creative and clever things. And here in the Kollel, they came up with this really brilliant idea. It's called Let's Study Talmud. Wow, I'm telling you, just like for action programming, you know. And we sit down and, you know, and it was my ox scored your ox, you know what I mean? And you know, and you're thinking to yourself, I really should get an ox, you know, because it comes up a lot more often than you'd think, evidently, you know. It's like, you know, I didn't really know this because I almost never run through the street with pictures, you know what I mean? And you know, and it's just old-time religion. It's not dressed up with anything fancy, you know. It's just we have a wisdom of the ages that have kept us alive. We've had a salt that has kept us here, and so many people in Las Vegas today are testimony to the fact that. You know, people like Yossi Kalter who came out here and touched so many lives in such a short period of time with only one goal, and that was to be able to bring that salt to so many people who have been able to not discover but rediscover what has kept us Jewish and kept us alive through the millennia. as Mark Twain writes, as every other civilization, we watch them come and go, and we're still here because real salt doesn't spoil. How appropriate that the way that we chose to memorialize him is by naming the Beis Medrash after him, where a person who dedicated his life to be able to bring the Torah, to preserve Judaism for so many people. Now there's a place so special through the centuries, what has made us have that gift of survival, the salt that has preserved us. Please God, this Beis Medrash should be a place where hundreds and hundreds of people have the opportunity to come and be able to taste and experience. I want to end with one terrible story that Woody Allen once said, I want to leave you with a positive note, but I don't have one, so I'll give you two negative ones. But anyway, if two negatives make a positive, I used to teach in Discovery, and at the end of Discovery, you went around the circle, and everybody would say one word that they felt summed up their experience, People would say interesting, nice, discovering, very clever, stuff like this. Anyway, one seminar we had this biker, every now and then you get a biker. It's unusual, in the Torah program, but big tattoos, big tough guy, chains, and stuff, And it comes around to him, you say one word and then you explain it. When it comes to him, he goes, angry. And I said, well, I'm dead. That's what the Hells Angels are waiting for me outside after the seminar. So when he explained it, he said, I'm so angry that I had this heritage, this special gift, and nobody ever told me about it before. And I'm so angry that I've been denied it all these years. The fact is that there are people who are willing to make sacrifices for one reason, because they care about us. They care about the Jewish people. And they want all of us to have the beauty and opportunity that they have. And Amir Hashem, the Kollel should continue to grow, and this Beis Medrash should be a place that serves as a memorial for Rabbi Kalter, who lived his life to be able to share that gift with others. Thank you very much.
At this time, we'd like to call upon Rabbi Eli Davidowitz to say a Kalmali. We'd ask everyone to please rise.